tried to pull some data because you guys were asking questions about the efficacy of individualized education plans. And while I didn't find anything direct, which is a little frustrating to not be able to find that data super easily, I think that you should be able to find that evidence well. What I did find is a couple things that are specific to interesting questions. One was related specifically to schizophrenia. And I know that historically schizophrenia has been identified in at least the Ohio laws as an automatic eligibility for evaluation. So once you have a diagnosis of schizophrenia, you're automatically eligible to be evaluated to see how much that disorder is impacting your education. Now that doesn't guarantee the IEP, but it does guarantee the evaluation. There has to be that deficiency in the educational process. But when a study was looked, and it was a 2018 publication where they looked at youth with a diagnosed schizophrenia spectrum disorder, not all of them had an IEP or any accommodations. And those that didn't actually have any better absenteeism or academic performance than those who did not, and it didn't seem to alter the rates of dropping out of school. So specific to schizophrenia, it didn't look like the IEP was necessarily helpful, which is not great, but that could speak to the need for heavy advocacy from the mental health community to make sure that the accommodations are actually helping the specific deficits. So maybe it's that they had an IEP, but the IEP wasn't geared in the way that it needed to be to really enhance their success. Another one that I thought was kind of interesting is it looked at health literacy and the difference in health literacy between students on an IEP or students without the IEP. And students with an IEP were 128% higher, had a higher risk of having limited health literacy. So having some intellectual or learning disability within any of the categories increased the risk of having poor health literacy. And those students with the IEP were also more likely to demonstrate risk across all of different kinds of health factors, including quality of life, health risk, and access to healthcare. So again, not that great of statistics and evidence where I could find it, sadly.
Glad you're looking.
Sure. It's one of those things that I could find myself on too far of a rabbit hole because I haven't found what I want, so then I dig for too long. But it does tie in very well to what I really wanted to talk about today. And I think part of the problem with what we see with the education system is that it was not really intended to do what we think it was. We do a lot of things in parenting and in education, work with kids where it's because I said so. And I think a big piece of that comes out of the industrialization of education. So in the 1960s, I always found this kind of interesting. George Land conducted a huge study, so 1,600 5-year-olds. And then he tested them. And when looking at creativity, 98% of those kids scored highly creative. Then he looked at that same group of kids at 10, and only 30% were then considered highly creative. By age 15, it was down to 12%, and by age 25, it was down to 2%. So what Dr. Land said is non-creative behavior is learned. We have that trained out of us. Everybody starts out almost everyone, innately creative. And what school has done, or the educational system has done, is in a lot of times it has pulled that creativity out of us. Part of that actually can be tied back to historical time periods because in the industrial era where you had this manufacturing boom, now you needed workers. Because the industrial era, as you had larger factories, you needed more people. With more people and more machines, you actually didn't need as much skill, so you could have fairly unskilled people, but you needed to have a lot in order to produce a lot and in order to make more money. So that happened to interestingly coincide with the expansion of public education at the same time. And there's even reference to factory model schools. So schools became the place where you train people to become good factory workers. Good factory workers comply. They don't challenge authority. They follow directions. They know how to fit in so they can become socially cohesive. They become efficient, and they become consumers. So much of what the way that our educational system is structured, and specifically, the K through 12, I'm not thinking so much college, but in K through 12, a lot of it has historically been tied to these types of principles. We're teaching people how to behave in society in the future. And when it started to really become more of a thing for everyone was at the same time that we needed factory workers. We needed people to go into the military. We needed interchangeable people and parts and less intellectual creativity, which inherently challenges authority in many situations. To be creative, you have to be willing to think outside the box and to challenge it and to say, no, that doesn't make sense. But that doesn't fit with factory systems. So tying back into last week's talk, where we talked about how there is a criminalization aspect and a medicalization aspect, and as the industrial society wanes and we need to become more creative, and tech is more of an industry, and we have more people going into college, and we need more creative thinkers. The school systems haven't necessarily adapted to that very well because they've been structured in an industrial manner. So what we see is that you get increases in both medicalization, because we don't know what to do with a lot of behaviors, or criminalization, because we still don't know what to do with a lot of behaviors and we have to do something with them when they don't fit in and they buck against authority. And I only found this a couple days ago, but my really fun example of this is of how the educational system is designed to teach compliance, and of why we need to help educate and advocate with our school systems, because they're not trained the way that we are. They're not thinking about behavior as it relates to trauma or as it relates to health. And they accidentally do things that are highly stigmatizing. So I found this in my son's room. And it's a couple years old, but he didn't do his summer reading assignment, apparently. And the title, "You've Been Pink Slipped." Doug, since you're laughing, Doug, would you like to explain what a pink slip is in Ohio?
Sure. For those who don't know, it's the sort of generic term we use for the application for emergency admission. It allows a physician or a law enforcement person, licensed psychologist, or a designated health officer to have somebody taken to an ER or some similar facility and held for up to 24 hours while they're observed to see if they need to be admitted to a hospital, basically. So it's an interesting choice of words.
Very interesting choice. It is pink. So on top of the fact that this is using really stigmatizing language, that sure, none of those kids would know what that meant because it was the 5th grade. None of those kids would know that, but had I seen that then and not several years later when I'm cleaning out his room before the next school year, there would have been a couple interesting conversations with that school personnel, because it not even pertaining to my son, but just being incredibly stigmatizing towards the mental health community.
Well, and actually for folks that worked at Lordstown, being pink slipped meant that you were
laid off.
Sure.
Yeah.
So it's never a positive.
No, never a positive thing. And unless we forget with an IEP, which my son was on the time for a speech issue, you can't give things without providing accommodations. And I'm curious how you provide accommodations for your summer reading. So that's that. A couple quick attempts to fix the current system. And this is where we end more positive, because there's a recognition that there are things that need to be fixed and we can be doing better. So one of them is the PBIS, the Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports Program that the entire state is pushing. And it's essentially a framework that allows children to be academically successful by focusing on behavior. So it's a positive behavioral intervention. And they try to use it. It's used a little bit differently in each school, but they are trying positive reinforcement techniques. So it's about engaging and promoting student academic success while focusing on behavior and using positive reinforcement. So instead of having teachers focus so much on like the discipline or criminalized side, understanding that if we start early and teach, good skills like empathy, self-confidence, good communication, that we can start to intervene earlier and get more positive behaviors just by reinforcing them in positive ways. We're also trying to move towards trauma-informed schools. So trauma-informed schools would be like any trauma-informed healthcare, where we're trying to understand that there are a lot of things that go on with people that we have no idea to, and many people have experienced trauma, and we know through the ACEs studies that is incredibly pervasive. So we should just assume that there might be something and try to minimize the potential to re-traumatize and impact children in a classroom in a negative way. So we're being sensitive that kids who have experienced trauma might need something a little bit different, and starting to teach teachers about how trauma might impact behavior. So sometimes the behavior you see isn't just a bad kid. The kid's not just being oppositional, but maybe there's a reason for what's going on and why they're acting out. There's also a big push to put opioid abuse prevention health education across the curriculum. And while I have some conflicting thoughts about this, because I think that it's good, but I think that you need to be careful about what kind of curriculum you're presenting, and they're giving some guidance, but not really specific recommendations. Or my concern is that I don't know everybody who's doing the teaching to the kids understands opiates and addiction and drug abuse as well as I would like them to be sending that message. And I think that we could be sending a message that's further stigmatizing if we're not careful. Nonetheless, they're saying starting in kindergarten, opioid abuse prevention can look like talking about the differences among foods, poisons, and medicines, and teaching social responsibility and personal responsibility. I can't disagree with that on the surface. Grades K through 12, it's a bit more intense, where they want them to have a review of what addiction is, proper handling of medications, understanding that prescription-only ingestion is what they should be doing, and the legalities and illegalities of some of that, but also to how to recognize symptoms of a drug overdose. And depending on the school and the age of the child, I mean, these are pretty touchy subjects. I don't disagree that they should be taught. It's a matter of, I hope that there's somebody who's doing this in a non-stigmatizing way, and in a way that teenagers are going to hear it and not make fun of it and then think that all of it's a joke, because that's the other thing we risk with kids. This actually makes me super excited. So Ohio, using some CURES money, is trying to spread the use of the PACS Good Behavior Game. And when you look at their website, it says PBIS, that positive behavioral interventions and supports, is what we want kids to do. But PACS Good Behavior Game is how we get there. And I love PACS. And this stuff is amazing. So it is a game that's inserted into the classroom instruction that is based all on the principles of operant conditioning. So reward versus punishment, but it uses the group contingent reinforcement that's applied during the lessons or during recess or during lunch to get the kids to start to cooperate together. So if we have the team, this classroom split into two teams, they know what behaviors will get them, are good and they're supposed to be using. And then they also have just silly words. So instead of calling it demerits, because kids don't care about that word, they call any negative behavior a spleen. And since that sounds funny to kids, they pick up on it pretty quickly. So you could say, so what are the spleens? And it would be talking out of turn, pushing. And the team that has the most spleens then doesn't get the prize. And the prize is something that they've all agreed upon. So you have this group dynamic that's reinforcing the behaviors. But they also implement this in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade. So you're teaching kids very early how to self-regulate, how to work together, and develop some core cognitive, emotional, and behavioral skills that are going to benefit them later in life. What's awesome about PACS is that it's actually been studied in depth. So starting back in 1984, they used Baltimore City schools, and they had across 19 different schools that were in 5 urban, low-income, and mostly Black areas. They studied more than 2,300 kids. They assessed them right at the beginning, They gave them follow-up interviews in 3rd grade, middle school, and again at 19 and 21. And what they found is that the kids who played the game had fewer problems with school or referrals to services, any kind of services for emotion problems, behavior problems, drug or alcohol. The students were less likely to smoke by like a lot. It was like 87% less likely to smoke. They were half as likely to think about or attempt suicide at any point. They were less likely to develop a conduct disorder, antisocial personality disorder. They were less likely to engage in risky sexual behavior. And they were more likely to graduate from high school. So just by putting this into K1 and 2, you're getting kids that when they're young adults are more functional, healthy adults. And it's easy. You don't have to have a therapist put this in. You teach the teachers how to use it when they're teaching math. You teach the people who are running the class, the lunchroom, how to use this during lunch, during recess. And you just use this, silly game with the kids, and we're getting more functional adults because they've learned how to identify and better self-regulate. And frankly, the kids who are standing out then are the ones who really are going to need the help, because they're the ones who really have a major problem, and we can identify them earlier and get them appropriate treatment earlier. So those are a couple of the resources that I was pulling from and links to various websites. When Jamie sends out the slides, there's also in the notes section of all of them is where I cut and paste all of my resources and links and article titles. So please always feel free to look into the notes section of the slides too. There's usually some information down there too. So